Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Rise Responder podcast. With me today is Mr. Eric Bauer. A lot of you will know Eric Bauer from FlightBridgeEd. He is the founder, the CEO, and I believe the chief educator for FlightBridgeEd. And Eric travels the world providing pre-hospital critical care education to EMTs, paramedics, nurses, flight services, and all kinds of stuff for critical care. And Eric's on board with us this morning to talk a little bit about how clinical competency can help to improve your mental wellness. Welcome to the Rise Responder podcast, Eric.
Hey, Rusty, great to be here. I know we've talked about doing this for a couple of years as you were coming up with this idea, so I'm excited to be on your show.
Absolutely. Well, it's an honor to have you. When we first started talking about me doing a podcast and things of that nature, one of the clear goals for me was to talk to somebody that was in the know. And Eric, you've got a podcast through FlightBridgeEd that is closing in on 100,000 monthly listeners. So you definitely know a little bit about podcasts, but what you know even more about is critical care education. It's one of your passions. And so congratulations to you for that.
Thank you.
One of the big things that I am curious about, and I think our listeners are probably going to be curious about as well, is how important it is to be competent at what you do. Not only for the patients that you serve, but also for yourself, to have that confidence, that lends itself to just making sure you're ready to go, both for them and for yourself.
Yeah, this is a big subject. It's actually a subject that I can reflect on some circumstances or some periods in my career where I came to the realization of this. I always felt like I had a high aptitude of trying to be the very best I could be, and studying and reflecting on calls and trying to always sharpen the sword. But I don't really think until this kind of point in my life, and I can talk about it. I think it's a good segue to talk about this subject. Until that happened, or until I had the realization, I don't think I really looked at it from this perspective. And I can tell you that it was life changing in how I look at things. And it was a conversation I had with my dad. My dad passed a few years ago, but it's one of those conversations that still get me emotional thinking about it, because it really kind of changed the trajectory of my career. Could have went a completely different way. So just a short recap. This is my 34th year in EMS, fire EMS. The last 22 years, I've been a flight paramedic and clinical educator. But before that, I was, and I've worked ground. I still work ground, but I was ground, and I always seem to get the bad calls. Kind of loved that, honestly. I felt like I was being challenged. I always wanted to try to rise to the occasion, but there was just one year that it was 2003 that just, it was too much. I mean, it was every shift. I seemed like I was getting something that was horrific and bad. And, I think it's one of those things where your cup spills over, right? You think you're handling everything fine, and it just takes that one call. And it was a motor vehicle accident, 16-year-old female that went off the road. Deer came out in front of her. She swerved, hit a tree. She was partially ejected, massive head trauma, already herniating when we got on scene. I RSI'd her. She was already bradying down. Got her to a level 4 trauma center where it was local, and parents show up and they want to talk to me as the paramedic. And it's just sad seeing the tragedy and seeing the parents and how they responded. And so I think that's probably the hardest part, is obviously, as is it's dealing with a family. It's seeing the hearing a mother cry for a child that they've lost, right, is something you'll never forget. If you've never heard that, obviously most of us have. So it was that call that kind of put me into a state where I felt like I was depressed. I didn't want to be a paramedic anymore. And I had wanted to be a paramedic since I was my earliest recollection, 4 years old. Like that was my dream. So for me to get to the point where I felt like I didn't want to be a paramedic anymore, there was definitely something going on in my mind. So I took a couple weeks off, and I was honestly contemplating what to do, which blows my mind now to think about at that. And I was a few weeks in, and um, I happened to call my dad. And as many of us have relationships with our mom and dad, especially for a male, I think dad's advice is usually one of those things that um, they know what to say. They've lived it before you, and he was a retired police officer, as a sergeant for the sheriff's office, and so obviously had a lot of experience in the emergency field. And he literally said one sentence that changed my whole perspective. And this is what he said. He said, "There's nothing you can do. Life has free will. There's nothing you can do when you see a family that are killed by a drunk driver, or that same drunk driver that survives it, or the tragedy that you see with a child getting hit by a car or drowning, or those are things that are out of your control. And so never, ever try to control that. The only thing you can control in your life is how prepared you are to do your job." Still gets me emotional because it was a simple sentence or two, and he was right. I was like, well, God, that's true. I can't change the emergencies we go to. I can't change those accidents, or those, a baby being beat to death, or, near death. And you just can't comprehend that stuff. But all you can do is control how prepared you are to do the job. And you focus on that, and that's all you focus on. And Rusty, I'll tell you, like it was like a switch was flipped instantaneously. I called the ops manager at AMR, said I was coming back. Ended up switching to another program about a year later, started flying shortly after that. Ended up moving to Tennessee, Kentucky area in 2008, 9. 3 years later, I founded FlightBridgeEd and the FlightBridgeEd podcast, right? And so I think of that stuff, and I could have none of the things that I've done with FlightBridgeEd, the podcast, all the education we've been able to deliver. Hopefully we've changed lives. None of that would have happened if I would have just fallen on the sword. And I don't want to say this the wrong way, right? This is my perspective for the listeners, right? I definitely think there's circumstances that you have in your life that, if you're in the military or even as a paramedic or nurse, where maybe you have PTSD based on certain situations, right? I have one that I think of that I still struggle with, and but I think for the most part, for me, I realized I was almost causing the issue to become bigger in my head by getting in my head, right? Because looking at all the things I thought I could control, or I don't know what I was thinking. But, that was just the advice. I think the greatest advice I've ever received is focus on your own clinical excellence. Focus on what you can do the best.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's clearly very wise words. As you said, who knows where he'd be now if it wasn't for that brief exchange with your father, who basically he told you that the only thing you can change is how well prepared you are. And I think that, like I said, when you prepare yourself to be able to manage incidents as thoroughly and as efficiently as you possibly can, then you don't have that rumination. You don't have that situation where you're like, well, what if I'd done this? Or, well, what if I'd done that? I think it definitely helps to be able to say, I really did everything that I knew to do. That certainly helps you to not only, feel better about your response to the incident, but it also gives you that bit of peace in knowing that no matter what you did, the outcome was still going to be the same. And I think that's something that can largely kind of fall to the wayside of people's thoughts when they're spending time going back and forth over runs, just worried about whether or not they did the right thing. If you're prepared and you prepare yourself consistently, you don't have that much of a self-doubt that causes problems for you.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to you still have to stay super humble, and you have to self-reflect, and you have to be be wise enough to look at your actions and evaluate yourself at a high standard and say, did I truly do everything? Were there were there areas of the call that I had to really think about, or that made me puzzled? Or you know I see it in the critical care realm, mechanical ventilation. Have I really worked on the art of mechanical ventilation? Do I understand the acuity and how to manage these high acute patients with a ventilator? And that's a problem industry wide. So it's looking at your own weaknesses and evaluating those, and then trying to get better every single day, and being humble enough to see that. You got to be able to see that. If you can't see that, you're never going to make a change. And I think, Rusty, the other thing that I've realized is, obviously as ground paramedics, we see a lot of stuff, and we do our very best. And clinical guidelines are different in every state and different counties. Uh, but I think what I realized on the aircraft is you're dealing with more acute patients more often, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even if we are providing the best care and the most advanced procedures and doing everything the right way, patients still die, right? So even if you are spot on and you look back and you're like, man, we hit every single thing. We could have maybe tweaked this. We maybe stayed on scene a little long, or maybe we didn't stay on scene long enough. Maybe we should have resuscitated longer on that airway, and that caused hypotension, and et cetera. But patients still die from catastrophic injuries, no matter how well you do. And we see that with trauma surgeons, right? We see that with the best, most renowned trauma surgeons in the world, or critical care physicians. Patients' acuity sometimes are they're so great that you still see a bad outcome, and you have to be okay with that. And I think that's the key: is some of us are able to let that stuff go, and some people are not, right? How do you deal with the tragedy of seeing a mom grieve for their son that was just hit by a car, right? And they're on scene and they see it. No, those are things that we don't want to relive. Um, but I think some of us are better at letting that stuff go than others. And I think that comes down to personality, maybe life perspective, age, right? I don't know. I mean, I'm curious to know what you think there. I mean, why is one person able to handle those things, let it go, and the other one isn't?
Yeah. So, in my perspective, and a lot of people get into the helping profession for reasons of kind of like their own healing, if they want to look at it that way. So they want to help, right? Because they felt as though they were helpless, when they were younger, um, or they witnessed something that really kind of made it difficult for them to make sense of the world. So I think a lot of people try to get into this profession, to help, to kind of control and kind of change people's lives. Um, I think part of it comes down to what you've done to help kind of gain your own sense of well being prior to being involved in this. Um, we can talk about things like adverse childhood events. The ACEs score, where people have dealt with uh, you know certain critical type incidents during their childhood, and of course that kind of lends to getting them involved in trying to help. Because they want to help, they want to heal. Um, some people have done a good job just through life circumstances, or just some mental resiliency. They've done really good at being able to cope with difficult situations. Others have not. And then, of course, there's also the aspect of, we all have different experiences in life. We've all dealt with different things. So some people simply can't get beyond some of the things that they've dealt with. I think specifically in terms of people like have dealt with like overdoses, people that have lived in a home where parents were drug abusers, parents went to prison for drugs, things like that. Those types of things are going to kind of hit a nerve with them. Same thing if you've had someone who's had a younger sibling or a cousin or something like that die prematurely in a car accident or something like that. Those types of calls are just more difficult for them to deal with. So It really does. It, like you said, it depends on the individual. Some can handle it well, some don't. And of course, the roles can reverse. Those same two people could deal with a totally different incident, and it really bothers one, and not the other. So, our world, our world as first responders is very dynamic, and there's never any absolute to what we're going to encounter. There's no way of knowing for sure. So, I think the big thing is just being prepared to look at situations from an angle of, if this bothers me, I have to let it bother me, because that's the fact of the matter. It's simply going to be what it is. And if it bothers you, then you need to get help. You need to reach out to someone to talk to them and kind of reflect on what you've dealt with, and try to make a difference in how your mind perceives it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's all well said. Again, I try to make things simple in my mind, and I've just found that has worked for me. That I'm going to see bad things. Um, I think I don't know how you feel. I mean, I think sometimes too, especially if we've done this a long time, you almost you almost become you almost look at a patient like you almost look through the patient,
Yeah.
right? I'm bad with names, right? I'm bad with names until I know you and I've used your name. I'll always remember a face. But a lot of times, we say sir or ma'am, or we'll say things like that, and I think it's a way to disassociate from the patient, right? And I definitely have reflected on that's definitely something that has manifested over my career, where I'm not good with names because of that. Or you have real sick patients and you're looking right through them. Doesn't mean you're not compassionate, you don't have a good bedside manner, but you're doing a job, right? You're
Hmm.
making the calls and running the call and getting things done, and so I think that helps as well, for some of us. But no,
Yeah, it does.
I agree. I agree. And I think this is a tough subject for me because, again, I don't want to ever take away from other people's ability to cope with those things. I just found that message from my dad to be life changing. Control what you can control, strive to be the very best at what you do, no matter what we're doing. You're in law enforcement, right? Be prepared, constantly evaluate yourself, and ask yourself, if you are missing something. I had a patient last night, that that it was one of those things where my gut instinct was saying there was something bigger, and he started asking me if he was going to die, right? And when patients ask you those questions, usually they're pretty sick. But everything that I was seeing, from his vitals, from his sats, from his lung sounds to his overall assessment, all the questions he's answering me, it was not matching what he was saying. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I muted my mic real quick.
You're good. I'll start over.
Yeah, that's
So
that's, that's okay.
everything that I was asking him, all my questions, my assessment,
Yeah.
it wasn't matching his his demeanor, right? And so I kept reassessing him, thinking I was missing something, right? And I think we always say vital signs are vital. Well, his vitals were normal, man. I mean, his
Hmm.
vitals were normal. His SpO2 was normal, but he was tachypnic is one thing. He was tachypnic. So then I'm thinking, is he early onset sepsis? Does he have a PE because he's tachycardic as well? So you're going through all these things. I just don't want to miss something. But I'm still thinking about that call. Like, did I miss something? And I think that that's where you have to stay curious, and you have to be able to reflect and evaluate yourself at a high standard, and constantly strive to learn more and talk to colleagues. Always put yourself in a room where you're not the smartest in the room, right? I try to
Absolutely.
surround myself with physicians that are brilliant, that other clinicians that I can learn from, and you should never want to be the smartest guy in the room or gal, and you should be uncomfortable in those situations and want to continue to learn. So that's the way I handle it. I don't know if that works for everybody, but definitely has worked for me since 2003.
Absolutely. I could imagine that it does. Because like you said, that curiosity, not only does it help you to become better prepared, but it also gives you the room to be, you know, to be humble, to, like you said, not to be the smartest person in the room, because, number one, you don't know everything. There's certainly always going to be somebody that knows more than you. But again, it gives you that curiosity to say, okay, well, what could I have done differently? What did I miss? What would be something that would make a difference in the outcome of my patient? To me, that is, in my 24-year career, I can still walk into a hospital, and I always try to follow up with certain patients that I'm particularly curious about, because I always want to know, well, what did they find that I wasn't able to find? Because we have those limitations, right? And that's the other thing too, is sometimes you have to be real honest with yourself, and just kind of take peace with the fact that you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah, no, spot on, spot on. Yeah.
And
I mean, and I
that's,
think that's, true wisdom is knowing what you don't know,
mm-hmm,
honestly, right? It's always scary as an educator when you see somebody that thinks they know, but they have no perspective that they don't know, right? And you got to be
mm-hmm,
teachable. And I think for your listeners, if this is something where you're trying to progress in your career, maybe you're an EMT, you want to be a paramedic, maybe you want to be a flight paramedic, maybe you're a nurse, you want to be a flight nurse, whatever you want to do, you want to go from ER to ICU, and you got to be interviewed. I think what I'm seeing around the country, as a consultant, is we're hiring people off of personality, not so much experience. Experience is great, but we're asking questions that really test your ability to be humble and teachable, and can we mold you? Every organization does things a little different. Nobody wants to know it all. And so how are you going to mesh with a team? How are you going to be in a group environment, right? Are you going to be divisive? Those are the key areas that we hire off of. We do not hire the most experienced person, right? I mean, if all things are created equal, that is the last thing we're looking at. It's how they're going to add and contribute to the organization. Are they going to tear a aeromedical side? You get one person in an amazing base, you add one nurse or paramedic that is divisive or like that, it can tear an entire base apart, right? So it is really important, and it's no different than an EMS agency or the hospital, the ER. One person can be that virus, and so that's my advice to people: is everything we're saying, Rusty, is applicable to just living your life the right way.
yeah. And that's the thing, when you're in a challenging, environment such as, pre-hospital care, first responder world, there's a lot of external inputs that kind of make it difficult to keep yourself on track sometimes. You get to thinking about those difficult runs, and I think sometimes people just want to escape what they've dealt with. And, I look at it from an angle of, when you look for a coping mechanism, what is actually going to be beneficial for you in the long run. Sure, it's easy to turn to alcohol and numb yourself and things like that, or it's easy to turn to, inappropriate relationships and things like that. Of course, that goes into all of the maladaptive stuff that kind of makes it bad. But I think there's a lot of peace that comes from being able to look at a run, and to be able to look at yourself, critically, and say, hey, these are things that maybe I should do differently. And I think that's another problem with our culture, is we're still spending a whole lot of time kind of being punitive after the fact when we have those bad calls. What can we do to take those bad outcomes, those bad situations, the things that are difficult and complex, and say, hey, this isn't about trying to assign blame or anything. This is about, this conversation that we need to have is about getting you better, is about making you feel like you contributed, and there are ways that we can contribute better. Not necessarily punitive, like I said, but really coming from an angle of growth.
Yeah, no, well said.
So to that end, 2003, you moved forward from ground service. Now, you said you worked at AMR. I'm assuming that's out on the West Coast, because I know you're originally
Yeah.
from the West Coast.
Yeah, I started with AMR in Portland, Oregon. I'm actually from Southern Oregon, moved up to Portland as my first paramedic job and worked that for 2 years. And then I transferred back south to a smaller county agency. When I was in Portland, I was in Multnomah County, dual paramedic ambulances, 32 ambulances on at one time, system status, really busy. And then went back to a service that had 6 ambulances on at once, everything but one is a 24. Um, and so you had longer transport times and things like that. And then that was still not the county I grew up in. It was, 20, 30 miles from the county I grew up in. And I actually had to travel 30 miles to work. And so I eventually went back to Southern Oregon, or to Medford, Oregon, where a different county where Mercy Flights is at. And Mercy Flights had the ground area so that ground service is very, very similar to Med Center. Bowling Green is very similar. Medford's a little bigger, maybe 20,000 more people, but very similar system, very similar setup. But they also had a helicopter and a fixed wing. And so I just went there as an FTO. They hired me as a field training officer. Had always been a dream to work for Mercy Flights since I was young. So it was kind of the next step. And within a few months, I was asked to be an acting supervisor, which required me to be cross-trained on the aircraft. So that's how I was introduced into the flight side, and then ended up taking a field supervisor position permanently, and got the flying bug from there. And uh, that's how all that went down. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that I always find impressive is, you started FlightBridgeEd in, what was it, 2009?
No, 2012.
2012.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you started that in 2012. What was really the impetus for you to starting such a, obviously it probably had quite humble beginnings, but what was the impetus for you to start something like FlightBridgeEd?
Yeah, man, I have to say we never thought it would be what it is today. I mean, that was never the goal. It was never supposed to be a business. It was, I had podcasting was very new at the time. There was a podcast out that most people know about called the MCRIT podcast. Scott Weingart, and he had started that in late 2009, and it really spoke to me. I loved his teaching style. I loved the concepts of taking ICU level care to the ER, and obviously being a flight paramedic, I used all the concepts that he was teaching. I mean, because we're doing that level of care in the helicopter, and you're held to that standard. So I was eating it up. There was a couple other podcasts. There was one called the ICU Rounds by Jeff Guy out of Vanderbilt. It was really in depth, that I loved, and those two were really the big two. And then along the same time, a website came out called Life in the Fast Lane. And if you Google like any medical related question, emergency medicine or whatever, I guarantee Life in the Fast Lane is going to pop up, right? And it's a group of physicians out of Australia that started that. So that was really the invention of FOAMed, free open access medical education was back then. And
Right.
before that, we didn't have anything. There was nothing out there, right? It was what it was. I mean, you learn from your peers and physicians you worked with and things like that. But I was flying at the time and doing a lot of outreach education and teaching a lot of different courses. And 2011, I moved to the Kentucky area. I took a position with Air Methods, Glasgow, Kentucky, the Kentucky 8 base, and I met my co-founder Evan Claunch. He was my relief flight paramedic there, and he had an IT background, and I had been toying with wanting to do something for about a year, and finally just popped in my head. I said, "Why don't we start a podcast?" And he had the ability to write the RSS feed. There was no companies back then that published podcasts, so we had to have our own media platform and had to do all that ourselves, the old-fashioned way. He built the first website. We named the company during shift brief one day, and it was just going to be a podcast. And so we just started putting out podcasts every 2 weeks, and then we just listened to the consumer. The podcast started growing pretty rapidly, and we got asked to teach a critical care, asked if we would be willing to teach a critical care review course for flight nurses, flight paramedics to get their, FPC or CFRN. So Ashley, my wife, she had at that time probably 2 years. No, it was a year and a half. She had been a nurse practitioner a year and a half, previous flight nurse. We wrote the first book and curriculum and started teaching in 2013, June of 2013. And we did that part-time until 2017. I was still working clinically. I was still flying as a float for Air Methods, went into education a few times. She was still working as a nurse practitioner in Med Center. And it was 2017 where I had to make a decision. I was either going to be gone for Air Methods or I was gone teaching a review course. And so giving up that salary was a big decision, but stepped out, jumped into it with 2 feet, and the company exploded when I did that, right? When I was able to really put all my time into it. And we've just really tried to listen to the consumer and try to fill problem areas and fill holes. We recorded our first online course in 2018 and started our online platform. And that's 3/4 of our revenue now. And we have hundreds of companies that subscribe, and we actually are probably just as much of a software company now as we are education, right? We have our LMS that we sell. We have a CRM that we sell called Emerge Logic. We've acquired some podcasts. We own the EMS 2020 podcast, which is the largest podcast in EMS in the world. And so we just try to make moves based on what we see as a need. And now we're 13 years in and still growing. So, there's pros and cons. Obviously, I'm gone constantly, so that can be difficult. I travel nonstop, but it truly is a blessing. I get to meet so many different people and get to see different agencies, and whether that's EMS, and we just don't do critical care. We supply education for EMTs to nurses, right? And so we have online content, courses, live courses, obviously in all demographics.
Yeah. Well, like I said, you've grown something that is quite remarkable, and with the variety of offerings that you guys have become known for providing over time, I think that's probably one of the best things about what you do is you provide those avenues for people who are hungry to learn, um, that want to really hone their skills and kind of get themselves into a position where they feel confident in what they're doing. Because again, we circle back around to the very beginning. You can't change the reality of the world that we live in. You can't change the circumstances that we face. However, what you can change and what you have to focus on is how you prepare yourself. And, while there are a lot of other aspects of it, you mentioned living right and things like that earlier. Another thing that is very important, obviously the job we do, and we have to be able to prepare to do it well. And to do that, we have to stay focused and hungry for that information. And you and your cohorts at FlightBridgeEd do a really good job of that. So as we close up here, Eric, just talk a little bit more about how important it is to you to really kind of focus in on that education that helps people to kind of gain that preparation that makes a difference in how they treat and moving forward in their career professionally.
Yeah, as I said, prior to really 2009, there was really nothing out there. I mean, I don't even remember what I did. You tried to learn and gain knowledge, as I said, from peers and from doing and physicians. And, I came from Southern Oregon where it was very progressive and very forward thinking. So that was really a blessing. But, I would say in these days and days, whether it's FlightBridgeEd or other companies, there is no excuse where you can't find the information. But I would say this: you got to make sure it's credible, right? You got to make sure, because there's a lot of people on social media that are spouting off things that are incorrect. I see it every single day on TikTok, where it's not the correct information, right? And that's a problem. Right now we have almost an overabundance of people coming out of the woodwork, and they don't have maybe the background, or maybe they don't understand the subject. It's not that they're being malicious; they just don't understand the subject like they think they do. And I can reflect back at certain times in my career where, you got to continue to immerse yourself in the same subject. You might hear something that somebody says a little differently, and it might be an aha moment. I was just watching a physician on TikTok the other night, and he said something about, your body's serum osmolality, overall, right? And the serum osmolality norm is how we regulate our fluid balance, and it's 275 to 295. Well, he's like, your over body's serum os is 300. Is 300, right? And so he was talking about, making a choice of normal saline LR. And what's the serum os of that, right? And normal saline's 308. It was just the way he said it that was an aha moment. And it's stuff I teach every week. But you're hearing it from somebody different that says it in a different way. And the goal is to continue to have those aha moments, continue to learn, and but you have to put in the time. And that's what I think I see probably from a failure standpoint is people want the badge, they want the title paramedic, they want the title nurse, but they don't put in the work, right? Once school's done, they're done. They don't put in the added work, and then they aren't clinically where they should be, right? And I just take that as it's such a responsibility to hold. What if that was your parents, your kids, your loved ones? So I think there's a sometimes it sucks having to study. Sometimes it sucks having to do online content or go into courses, but it's a responsibility that you took. And so I think there's no excuse now with the information out there. You got to make sure it's credible, that you understand the evidence that they're talking about. Our podcast, Rusty, this podcast is a little different, right? But if I put out a podcast on the FlightBridgeEd podcast and I start talking about a medication, or I start talking about a new procedure or something like that, like I'm very careful to make sure that I cite my sources. And that if this is a observational study is right above a podcast. And podcast is expert opinion only. And I'm just, at the end of the day, paramedic. Yeah, I hold a doctorate in education, but I'm still a paramedic. I'm not an MD. And so when you look at, if I'm citing a reference of a randomized controlled trial, well, there's a lot of validity there. And so there's a big difference in listening to that and understanding that. So the listener has to understand what they're hearing. If they don't understand the hierarchy of evidence, and they hear something that's observational or expert opinion, and they take that as a true thing that they're going to go apply, and there's not a lot of valuable evidence to support that, you can get yourself into trouble. So it's a responsibility of whoever's teaching to make sure they outline those things, right? And so that's what I mean by you got to understand what you're hearing as well.
For sure. And I think that's a big thing for me too, is there's definitely a wealth of information that you can find out there. And as you said, you go on TikTok or any of the social media platforms, whatever your desire is, and you hear, like you said, a minute, 2 minute, 3 minute video, and you take that as gospel. Well, there's so much more that's not cited. There's so much more that is not there. Like, you don't see the other little caveats of, well, what if it's this, then you go back to this, or if this isn't present, then you're dealing with something totally different. So you have to be careful with the information that you use as kind of, clinical guidance. And of course, as you say, you obviously follow the practices and procedures that are, deemed necessary by your medical direction and things like that. So again, we circle back around to that preparation thing, because I think that's important. I think what you said there, and it probably will end up being your word of advice again to our listeners. But as we do close up here today, I would like for you to say, tell me what it is that you would advise a first responder who's really kind of struggling with trying to find their place in their career. What would be, from your perspective, what would be something that you feel they need to hear?
I mean, man, two things I live by: work when others are sleeping, and practice till you can't get it wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. When I really started getting into podcasting, I started listening to a few things, and, I kind of got into a routine where I listened to some motivational videos every morning. And one of my favorite ones that I used to listen to was the Joe Rogan inspirational podcast. And one of the things he said was, the pro goes to work, and the truth is, our work is important and it is unique. So we have to put in that unique effort and we have to go to work, not only when we're clocked in, but when it's time to sit back and reflect and learn how to do our job even better.
Absolutely.
Well, guys, I have had Mr. Eric Bauer with the FlightBridgeEd on board with me this morning. I've certainly appreciated our time, Eric. It's a great honor to get some introspection and some of your experiences to add to this growing list of information that I'm passing along to our first responders within the community. So, thank you for your time, and we'll see you soon.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate you.
Yes, sir.